Fake news. It's a term that has seen a lot of resurgence in the last 6 years, and many of you have probably heard it from former President of the United States, Donald Trump. Maybe you've heard it from different media outlets, and if you're a communications major, you've probably heard it in your freshman year of college. But what is fake news, really? Is it a term Trump created? Is it a phrase to condemn news media? How long has it been around? What's it used for? Do people willfully share it? Well, let's dive in and figure out if we can learn more about fake news and its applications in society. First, let's talk about the terms for fake news. You might have heard these in a variety of situations, but these terms could include spin, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, spoof news, a cock and bull story, media manipulation, clickbait, parody, satire, or false facts. Regardless, fake news sort of exists as an oxymoron, meaning news is supposed to be an analytical approach to information that was not previously known to a person. So the reason it is an oxymoron is because fake implies it isn't real or truthful. So how can fake news be information? When we know information is supposed to be facts provided or learned by a person. But what is the definition of fake news? According to the University of Michigan's library, fake news is defined as a term that has come to mean different things to different people. At its core, we are defining fake news as those news stories that are false. The story itself is fabricated with no verifiable facts, sources, or quotes. Sometimes these stories may be propaganda that is intentionally designed to mislead the reader, or may be designed as clickbait written for economic incentives. The interesting references to the propaganda aspect, which is defined in the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as ideas or statements that are often false or exaggerated and that are spread in order to help a cause, political leader, a government, among many other things. So now we have some definitions, which is going to be the start of our understanding of what fake news is. But in order to possess a stronger grasp, let's take a look at the history and why in some cases it might have been used. According to the Center for Information Technology and Society at UC Santa Barbara, fake news has been used a lot throughout history, whether it be in ancient Greece, Rome, or in more modern instances, such as Nazi propaganda to build anti-Semitic sentiments. There are a lot of examples, but we will start with the journalism side. In the 1890s, rival publishers Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst began to report rumors as though they were facts. At the time, this practice became known as yellow journalism. The reason was to draw audiences toward the respective publications in order to sell more and reap the benefits. Their roles would eventually lead the U.S. into the Spanish-American War of 1898. And for a brief history lesson, Cuba, a Spanish colony at the time, wanted independence from Spain in February of 1895. Of course, that discourse had been building up until that point, but it started to really boil over during this time period. And due to Spain's repressive measures to halt the rebellion, several news outlets portrayed the rebels in a sympathetic light by engaging in yellow journalism, which then led the U.S. public to be more invested in the Cuban rebels. U.S. intervention then became a growing popular demand, especially after the unexplained sinking in Havana Harbor of the USS Maine. If there's one thing most Americans don't like, it's having our servicemen be targets. So, with yellow journalism, it kind of painted that picture. Add in the fact the USS Maine was in Cuba to protect U.S. citizens and property after rioting in Havana, then you have a real recipe for conflict and discourse. War eventually would be declared, and we have no idea if it would have happened with or without yellow journalism. To break it down even further, fake news can be used to portray and influence members of the public to rally behind a cause through less than truthful method. Essentially, it's meant to show a story without including the facts. Now, if you're wondering whether this is ethical or wrong, you're not the only person. A lot of people use the analogy, do the ends justify the means, right? I just want to make it very clear that I am not going to tell you whether it is right or wrong, and I actively encourage anybody who watches this to ask questions about the content that you are viewing so that you can come to that determination on your own. Now, I think this will be an important tidbit of information so that we understand more about my examples as we go forward. For a brief moment, I want to explain what agenda setting is and how it may apply to fake news. Agenda setting is how media sets up stories to be seen by the public. Not necessarily telling you what to think, but what to think about. It sets the stage for conversations to happen about specific instances going on, whether it be locally, regionally, nationally, or globally. Agenda setting relies on media gatekeepers to some degree. They determine what airs and what doesn't. To reference the Spanish-American War, in that instance, Pulitzer and Hearst would be the media gatekeepers. However, in today's age with commodities such as the internet, uninvolved citizens are able to pass information at a rapid pace and have it go viral. This is in large part due to what's called shared media. Shared media is more of a public relations term, but it boils down to news and information being passed through social media channels such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, stuff like that. Okay, so now that we understand what agenda setting is, let's talk about communism. A simple breakdown of communism would be that it is a philosophical, social, political, and economic ideology whose goal is the development of a socio-economic order that is founded and built upon the ideas of common ownership. But you're probably saying to yourself, why do I want to hear about what communism is? This video isn't about communism. You're right. This video is about misinformation and fake news. So why bring it up? Well, communism at one time was a heavily scrutinized belief in the U.S., eventually peaking during what we call the Red Scare. For more context, countries such as Russia were influenced in part by communism. And as we know, the U.S. has a somewhat tense relationship with Russia. Some of the effects of the Red Scare resulted in people being blacklisted from employment in the entertainment industry if there was even a belief that another person could be a communist. Figures such as Charlie Chaplin, Langston Hughes, Orson Welles, and Lena Horne were all blacklisted because people thought they were communists. And whether or not they were, I honestly have no idea. I didn't look that deep into these people, but they were really, really prominent figures during this time frame. If you want to look it up and find out for yourself, I encourage you to do so. And let me know. But anyway, this was under a campaign whose central and vocal proponent was Senator of Wisconsin Joseph McCarthy. You've probably heard the term McCarthyism, which the original term was actually dubbed in a Washington Post cartoon, and McCarthyism as a whole had a serious string of propaganda attributed to it. There would be cartoons depicting America falling to a communist regime, and this was not something that was really uncommon to see. And as we explained earlier, propaganda are ideas or statements that are often false or exaggerated and that are spread in order to help a cause, political leader, a government, and the list goes on and on. So why did McCarthyism spread? The propaganda that was used to spread it primarily used fear. Fear of a new regime that would effectively wipe out America's principles. Further, American leaders repeatedly warned the public about communist influence in their lives. They would go on to say that communists could be school teachers, coaches, artists, bankers, labor organizers, or journalists. It frightened American citizens. For more context, in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested a nuclear bomb, and communist forces led by Mao Zedong took control of China. Then we would have an active role in the Korean War by fighting the communist-supported forces of North Korea. To put it simply, we had plenty of world events to shape how Americans perceive communism. However, just to be clear and upfront, not all Americans supported McCarthyism. Former President of the United States Harry S. Truman would go on to criticize the Eisenhower administration as well as McCarthyism. Truman would go on to say, "It is now evident that the present administration has fully embraced, for political advantage, McCarthyism. I am not referring to the senator from Wisconsin. He is only important in that his name is taken on the dictionary meaning of the word. It is the corruption of truth, the abandonment of the due process law, is the use of the big lie and the unfounded accusation against any citizen in the name of Americanism or security. It is the rise to power of the demagogue who lives on untruth. It is the spreading of fear and the destruction of faith in every level of society." McCarthyism would decline by the mid and late 1950s, thus weakening institutions that supported McCarthyism. Now, that was a rather long explanation on fake news and McCarthyism, so let's transition to bias. First, let's define bias. Bias, as per the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, etc., are better than others that usually results in treating some people unfairly. It is also a strong interest in something or the ability to do something. At its core, bias is an inclination for specific outlooks. Examples could be right-wing, left-wing, middle, far-right, far-left, conservative, liberal, and independent, amongst others. We're going to look at 3 articles centered around Tucker Carlson's interview with Kyle Rittenhouse following a judgment of not guilty for Rittenhouse in his role for the Kenosha, Wisconsin shooting during the summer of 2020 at a protest centered around the Black Lives Matter movement following the shooting of Jacob Blake by police, who was paralyzed after the incident. The sources of these articles will include the Daily Beast, The Hill, and the Daily Wire. We'll start with the headlines of each source before we move through the information as presented in the articles themselves. For specification purposes, the Daily Beast is a left-leaning news outlet, The Hill is in the center, and the Daily Wire leans to the right. To start, the headline in the Daily Beast article is, Kyle Rittenhouse tells Tucker Carlson, I support the Black Lives Matter movement. The Hill's headline reads, Kyle Rittenhouse, I support the Black Lives Matter movement. And the Daily Wire reads, Kyle Rittenhouse describes his time in jail. A month longer, I probably would have been in a hospital. There is a clear difference between the Daily Wire's headline and the other two. Whereas the Daily Beast and the Hill show a direct quote about Kyle Rittenhouse supporting Black Lives Matter, the Daily Wire focuses on Kyle Rittenhouse's period of incarceration. When diving into the Daily Beast article, it frequently quoted Rittenhouse's interview with Carlson and quoted Rittenhouse as saying he was not racist, supports the Black Lives Matter movement before discussing the not guilty verdict from the trial. The Daily Beast would then demonstrate bias by describing Tucker Carlson, a Fox News host and commentator, as being known for stirring up moral panics and invoking racist dog whistles on his shows. That sentence can be highlighted as a bias bleeding through the article. Further, by describing Carlson as scowling and making a somewhat sarcastic remark that the documentary Carlson has been working on for the Kyle Rittenhouse story is, quote, not at all conceived as a means of driving up subscriptions to the conservative channel's streaming service. For the average person, you can probably detect that sarcasm, which further demonstrates a less than favorable attitude towards Fox News and Tucker Carlson. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the Daily Wire was much more sympathetic toward Rittenhouse, constantly focusing on Rittenhouse's mental health and quoting Rittenhouse frequently about the severity of his dreams, what could have happened, self-defense, and his treatment for PTSD, as well as the poor conditions of the jail that he was being housed in. The bias for the Daily Wire is a lot more passive, but more prevalent than the other articles by framing the interview as a physical and mental health topic. Finally, The Hill was primarily focused on the facts of the case and quoted Rittenhouse. The Hill included quotes by Kyle that show his support of Black Lives Matter, peacefully demonstrating his desire for change and a prosecutorial misconduct before bouncing back to the facts. The Hill also had a quote from Shavar Jeffries, a civil rights attorney who expressed her views surrounding the results of the trial. This may seem small, but it follows a more inclusive atmosphere. On the one side, you have Kyle Rittenhouse, who believes they acted in self-defense. On the other, you have Shavar Jeffries, who is on the opposite end of Rittenhouse's belief. But let's ask the question, does bias make a story into fake news? Not necessarily. However, there are more extreme sources where biases dominate an article and may contain a lot of speculation, as opposed to factual and analytical recounting of news. Bias can also be a factor in what we spread across social media. So now we are going to look at an example of how bias can override facts, context, and demonstrate selective analysis. YouTuber Paul Joseph Watson runs separate channels. Watson is a far-right 39-year-old British commentator who previously worked as editor-at-large for Alex Jones' InfoWars. Watson was banned on Facebook and Instagram for hate speech in May 2019. Watson's secondary channel, Anything Goes, will be the focus, and we're going to analyze and determine whether or not the video can be considered fake news or trustworthy. The video title reads, COP26 globalists enjoy meat while telling you to eat bugs. And the topic is primarily centered around the United Nations Climate Change Conference that occurred in Glasgow, Scotland from October 31st to the 13th of November. We're going through this video together to see what type of sources and language Watson uses. Let's jump into it.
Climate change technocrats keep telling us that we're going to have to eat bugs to save the planet. You know who won't be eating bugs? Climate change technocrats. The menu for globalists attending the COP26 environmental panic fest in Glasgow has been revealed, and suffice to say, it's not very environmentally friendly.
So let's stop here and define some terms he has used. The first term is technocrats, which is not something I think most people are privy to knowing. Technocrats support technocracy, which is defined by Oxford Languages as the government or control of society or industry by an elite of technical experts, while globalist refers to a person who advocates the interpretation or planning of economic and foreign policy in relation to events and developments throughout the world.
Campaigners say it beggars belief that nearly 60% of the menu is animal-based, with burgers, venison, beef ramen and haggis all featuring despite their high carbon footprint. According to the WWF, we need to get the carbon footprint of food down below 0.5 kilograms CO2 per meal to reach the goals defined in the Paris Agreement, reads a statement on each page of the online menu. And you know what doesn't do that? This menu! The haggis, neeps and tatties option used 3.4 kilograms of carbon to produce according to the conference's owning rating system, doubled the carbon footprint of the average UK meal of 1.7 kilograms and nearly 7 times higher than the 0.5 kilograms target.
Okay, so the first source he uses is slightly disingenuous on Watson's part. He does not disclose the source of the article, and when segueing to the portion with Scottish larder, you wouldn't know that it's part of the same source. This does not necessarily mean that Watson is orchestrating selective coverage, but it is a red flag when commentators do not directly attribute a source.
Critics said it was like serving cigarettes at a lung cancer conference, but far from being a shock, this is all tiresomely predictable. After arriving at the conference in a fleet of 400, count them, 400 private jets, do you really think that these climate con artists would give a damn about a beef burger? Just like the mask mandates, they're demanding you alter your lifestyle while they continue to do as they please. Sky News is normalising the idea of you eating bugs to reduce your carbon footprint. They're also sponsoring the conference while amplifying its propaganda by falsely describing it as news.
We'll stop here and break down some more of his sources. The Sky News source he used was actually a link to a playlist on YouTube that discusses a large variety of environmental subjects, which would include renewable energy, cattle farming, air pollution, reducing plastic packaging, and green technology, amongst many more. Below, they created a poll asking if people would eat bugs if it solved climate change, which an overwhelming majority said no. Also, Watson starts to utilize a somewhat condescending tone by stating that the attendees of the conference are, quote, con artists, and then draws a parallel to mask mandates. And by now, we know this isn't sound reasoning because the Sky News tweet does not endorse nor advocate for eating insects. And by examining the sources we have been presented with so far, there is no determination that attendees of the conference are advocating to eat any insects at all. Watson continues by describing the two Sky News pieces as propaganda without showing any portion of the source. This would also be a red flag. I read through the bottom article and found it to be about the Paris Rulebook. The Paris Rulebook is a detailed guidance on how countries must work towards a zero carbon emissions future. It was created in 2015, but still has issues that have not been addressed. The majority of the article discusses those issues and the prospects for reaching agreements on those issues. As we have seen before, this probably doesn't fit the definition of propaganda, which would be another red flag for Watson's video. The above piece is actually a Q&A by economics editor Ed Conway. The Q&A largely addresses the economics of climate change technology. This wouldn't necessarily be an example of propaganda either, because Conway has expertise in the field of economics and they are not directly positioning themselves to push an agenda, nor are they exaggerating or possibly lying about climate change technology, but instead is offering perspective from his experience in economics and how it relates to renewable energy and climate change technologies. On top of that, a Q&A is more of a public forum, where in some capacity, anybody would be able to ask them a question and get some kind of response in relation to the topic of the forum.
news. But you know who won't be reducing her carbon footprint? The CEO of Sky, Dana Strong, who regularly commutes by private jet from her home 3,500 miles away in the United States. These technocrats want credit cards that block your purchases if you exceed your carbon emissions limit, but they'll continue to gorge their fat faces on the best prime fillet steak. Well, if they get their way, your menu will consist of a choice between mealworms and dried grasshoppers.
Watson then brings up another article by The Telegraph that details Sky News CEO Dana Strong. Watson does not disclose that Strong remains based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is close to the headquarters of Sky's parent company, Comcast. Further, he doesn't elaborate that the purpose of the private jet is for security and productivity reasons. One thing that can be justified is Strong travels back and forth every few weeks. However, it was not disclosed that she moved to the UK in June, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Strong was unable to move her family, which resulted in Strong traveling back to the US in order to visit her family. The article would then lead to a company spokesperson who reiterated Sky's position as working towards lowering emissions. This was also left out by Watson. This could also be another red flag. In conclusion, this video had a lot of red flags, but I would urge anyone watching to come to a conclusion on whether this fits the bill for fake news, misinformation, or propaganda. If you determine this, you'll be one step ahead when verifying sources in the future. Now, let's move on to how fake news spreads. A new study published in Science found that falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than the truth, and false news reached 1,500 people about 6 times faster than the truth. Those are some scary figures to think about. Cognitive bias can also be a factor in how we share information with other people as well. According to Scientific American, cognitive bias simply means we prefer information from people we trust, our in-group. It would not be far-fetched to theorize that the spreading of misinformation can happen because we see something being shared by a friend of ours. It effectively demonstrates an easier attempt of persuasion than with a stranger. Or, maybe it's bots. Automated accounts that aren't real people that are posting false story after false story. To some degree, that would be true. Bots mostly function by posting and then retweeting other bots so that the story can infiltrate different circles and interact with actual human users. But the main culprit is actually cognitive laziness. According to MIT Sloan Associate Professor David Rand, they asked 3,446 participants to rate the accuracy of headlines from actual news stories from Facebook. They found that falling for fake news is a symptom of cognitive laziness as opposed to motivated reasoning or self-deception. However, they did discover that people who engage in more analytic thinking are better at determining true from false, regardless of identified motivations or political biases. They were actually better at determining real from fake when the content fit their political views. So, now we know a good amount of information about fake news. We know some of its history, how it spread, and we've learned a few terms along the way. But the final question is, what can you do to not fall for it? This is just a general list of tips, but I think that will help you. Tip number 1, examine the source and author credentials and affiliations by researching the background of any resource you are using or considering using. Number 2, evaluate the sources that are cited by the author and determine whether it's an academic source or comes from somewhere else. Number 3, check to see if the data is relevant to what you're reading. Things go out of date quickly in today's age. Number 4, look and see if the publisher source is reputable by using a media bias chart or fact-checking websites to inform you. Number 5, beware of bias. Bias is present in most outlets to some degree, but as we explored earlier, it can result in selective coverage that calls into question the validity of what the source is. Number 6, if there are facts and figures, make sure the study is cited and looks reputable. And number 7, look at the headline and verify if it's too good to be true. In conclusion, there are a slew of tactics you can use to understand if a post, story, article, book, study, website, etc. are telling the truth. Remember terms like agenda setting, bias, cognitive bias, propaganda, and everything else we explored in this project, and you will have more questions than you did before. Of course, I want to encourage you to verify all the information I have given you. Question me, question my narrative, and question the content shown in this video. Always ask questions. Thank you.